Hi, welcome to Nothing Venture, Nothing Game. I'm your host, GM Jared, and today I'm joined by Rules Arbiter Steve.
Yo.
And we're going to be talking about a video we both kind of watched, and it spurred some of our thoughts, and we just wanted to have a conversation about. So, is this a reaction video? Sure, because we are reacting to a video. Is it our response to their conversation? Sure. So stick around. The video was from Runehammer. Check out in the links somewhere around here. There will be a link to that video and in the description below. So you could go actually see the original video where they talk about this idea. But the conversation was about spells and how spells can work in your system and changing the spell casting mechanic. And one of the points I really want to talk about in this video is how the GM should not be limited to spells that are solely from the game they're playing. And Runehammer brings up a great point in his video talking about how the GM should make spells up that fit their monster, the spellcasting monster, obviously, not just like the kobold. If it's a kobold, if it's a spellcasting kobold, fine. But if it's just like a generic kobold, all of a sudden it could like cast like Cobalt Flame or something. But it's more about having the opportunity and the leeway as the GM or the game arbiter to have this like power. So I feel like that's kind of a very general assessment of the video. There's multiple points in the video that they speak on, where they speak on changing how spell mechanic works, and additionally how spells can work in your system and your game, and then talking about how the GM should have this freedom of the shackles from the books to making their own spells. So Steve, why don't you take us through some of the points that you saw in this video that you wanted to talk about, and then we'll talk about them, and then I'll jump over to my point about the spellcasting mechanics for the GM and how I feel as the eternal GM liberated by that notion.
So the video from Runehammer over here it's called RPG Mainframe. It's called Spells. That's kind of the RPG Mainframe is kind of their series in this, where they're talking about different things about RPGs. And then their actually main point in their video was that the whole spell system should be kind of changed, because we're getting to the point where we're playing in D&D, we're playing in Pathfinder, and a majority of their book is dedicated to spells and how they work and all the different spells, and the wizards cast these spells and the druids cast these spells and the clerics cast these spells, and then some of them don't cast the other spells, and it's just like it gets crazy. And their point was to revamp everything to where maybe your world only has 12, 24, 30 spells to it. And so the players would have these lists of spells, and maybe they can develop their own spells. And then obviously the monsters would have, whatever the monsters have. Maybe the monsters have some of this lost magic. For me, I'm on board with half of the system. Like I said, with your thing, a bunch of us want to sit down and we want to play Pathfinder. We want to play D&D. We want to play one of these more complicated systems that does have a spell, a quote unquote answer for everything. I'm all board for that, because I think the one issue is that sometimes spell casting takes time. And we're not talking about how long it takes to cast a spell. We're talking about how long it takes to figure out what the caster can actually do on their turn. But on the other hand, that requires a lot of buy-in from the players to say, hey, we're playing the system that we all agreed to, we all bought the books for, and now we're going to throw up a whole section of this book, and only the people who cast magic will be affected by my rules change. So maybe that's your whole story of the game. Maybe it's a campaign thing where your old campaign, something happened and all magic went away, and that's the whole theme. If that's the whole theme, go for it. But for us, to revamp the whole system for the players, that's a lot of work. And part of the reason we decided to buy a published product is it's published already. Someone did the work for us, and we don't have to go through and have to revamp spells and whatnot. Not saying we don't have the ability, but sometimes we just want to play the game and not necessarily have to like revamp a system. On the other hand, we talked about like what is the one responsibility for a player? The one responsibility for players is to know everything about their one character. They need to know everything their character can do, whether it's the fighter and how well they fight and defend and armor and all that stuff, tripping, running, all that stuff, paladins, shields, and then you have spellcasters. They need to know how the spells work, but they're still only responsible for their one dedicated character. On the other side of that table is the GM or the DM or a storyteller or what have you. And they're responsible for that monster that casts spells, the monsters that don't cast spells, the NPCs that the players keep pestering for information, all the trap rules, all the rules on, like what the NPCs are thinking that, like I said, we talk about the NPCs. Oh, they want to talk to that random guard. We didn't even think it was an NPC. Now we have to figure out Bob the guard now has to talk to the NPCs, the players, because now the players are starting to talk to them, trying to make them the standard NPC. As GMs, we have a lot of overhead. We have a lot of stuff in our head. And so not only do we have the next fight that may have that hag with spells, plus a whole bunch of other like weird creatures that defend the hag, but then there's that second fight that's in like 2 rooms from now. So we had to prep that too because we expected the players to get there. And then maybe the boss battle is coming. So we prepped that a couple times just in case they decided to skip the second room and go straight to the boss battle. We had to have that in our heads too. And we have all this other stuff in our head. So sometimes having spells exactly as written in the rule set that you chose is a bit much. Do I care that lightning bolt has a 500-foot range? Do I care that the exact radius or how many rounds a wall lasts? Because fun enough, we were talking about that from before we were getting ready for this video. You had walls and you had trackers for each wall that your little characters are cast. And I told you that I wouldn't even track it at all. It lasts for the combat. So stuff like that is following the exact rules of the spell worth the overhead in your head to track all those little things. And a lot of that little minutia stuff isn't worth it for the vast majority of the fact that you're running 3 or 4 or 5 different characters in a combat. And you've prepped 3 combats or 2 combats, and you've prepped the information, the wall, the block text for the next 2 rooms because you want to be able to read it, quickly, and you don't want to stumble over your words because I do that all the time. Like, oh, hold on, I got to find the answer to that one question that the PCs asked that I didn't have the answer for. So it's a lot of overhead. So I'm more of a fan, and I think I talked about this in one of the other videos that we did. Well, I'm more willing to look at a stat block and go, oh man, you cast spells. Great. What kind of magic what is your job? In the fight with your spells, what is your job? And then I will take those spells and I will dumb them down into an action. So meaning I don't necessarily have to know every least little thing about that spell. I need to know how much damage it does. Is there a save? Is there an attack roll? And is it short, medium, or long range? So in my head, short range would be 30 feet. Medium range would be maybe half the battlefield, so like 60 feet, like lightning bolt sized ish, and long range is anywhere on the battlefield. Like I don't even worry about that at that point if I'm figuring out like long range, or if it's like a 1 or 2 rounds. If it lasts, like I fear you, or we already know fear in Pathfinder. The way it works is every round you tick down your fear until it goes to 0. Yeah. Okay, so I don't have to worry about a duration. That's on the player. The player, I say you feared 3. Okay, that's on the player now to figure that out on their end. Or I know that this fear lasts, or maybe another spell lasts for 2 rounds or round, right? So, okay, I can remember that. Well, 1 round or 2 rounds of things that maybe is an effect on the field, or it's slippery because someone casts grease or whatever. Whatever it's like anything 5 rounds and up, it just lasts the combat. Or if there's some sort of condition that lasts like, it lasts until, like you're bleeding until you get healed. Or, or just take your pick on is it worth for you to have to track every least little detail about your spell because you have so much other stuff to worry about?
Now, you bring up a lot of good points there, right? Talking about spell length and how the spells affect the battlefield and the players, and how the GM does have to run so many options. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate, and I'm going to, because I have to, right? Because I agree. I wholeheartedly agree with creating your own spells and having them do what you need them to do. because there was a number of times where I looked at a monster. I need a spellcaster monster, but it has to be a wraith, right? Or undead. And you click undead, and most undead monsters, and depending on the system, but let's say Pathfinder, many undead monsters in Pathfinder cast from the divine, unless you're talking about a lich, and then that casts from the arcane. But maybe I want an undead treant that also has nature magic. And it makes sense, but I now need to look for a specific creature that kind of fits that. And I'm always the one who says, hey, if you find a creature in the book that kind of does what you want, that's the creature. Is it a kobold shaman? Now it's a treant druid, because it works with the spells you need. But changing the spells and just making the monster have the spells goes so much faster in your prep time. Because not only am I running everything else in this game, but maybe I'm also, I love doing this, right? Like, so I have 2 little ones and I need downtime. And my downtime, I like making terrain. Steve knows this. I paint and I make terrain. Or I buy terrain and I paint it. So I'm also doing that for my game. And now I have all this extra stuff. And I have to sit down and I need to remember to bring this terrain and that terrain. And I need the tree of woe, because that's where, like all that stuff. So I agree with Steve. But I'm here to play devil's advocate, because if this whole video was I agree, click off.
We're done.
We're done. All right, the fastest video ever.
Now we can get to sleep on time.
Yeah, woo. But devil's advocate. Now, my argument for using the spells as written is it's a balanced system, right? So the players are balanced to the GM. So we're playing on an equal footing, right? That's if I'm not fudging my rolls, right? That's me not changing the DC on the fly. Oh, it's a 24 in the book, and Zach's character rolled a 24. Well, now it's a 25 because I want that character to get hit, right? That can, that's something that like you have to remember, right? Like,
yeah.
So that allows everyone to know that we're all playing fair, both the GM and the players. Now, do I think the GM should play fair? No. I'm the guy that will always argue the GM should not play fair. Now, I'm not trying to win. A GM should not try to win. A GM should be there to help facilitate a story, a cooperative story. I'm not saying the GM has to be the greatest storyteller or should be a storyteller. They should just help facilitate the story, right? But that's a different video. But my argument for them using the spells as written is so that everyone agrees that this is right. The fireball doesn't do 20 D20s. How do you feel about that, Steve?
So if I take a look at a particular stat block, and this is kind of going into if you're trying to use a specific monster, like Jared was like, I want a undead treant with nature magic. Okay, well, there's not a creature like that. I'm pretty sure there's not a creature like that. Maybe there's a creature like that, but it's not at the right level. So maybe it's too high or too low, and then you have to figure out. So I kind of do the standard GM cheat that we all should learn and use is find something that gets too close, and then adjust what you need to adjust. So I'm not saying that this creature has a fireball, he's first level, but he can cast fireball at will and it does 1,000,000 D6 damage. No, what I am saying though is this also comes from the fact that I know the spells, okay? I know the spells, so if something tells me to roll fireball and it says it's at 6th level, I know how much damage that deals. I know approximately the range of that spell. I know the radius of that spell when it explodes. I know how many actions it takes. But also from a perspective of someone who's brand new, who doesn't have all that back knowledge, some of this information that this spell gives you is erroneous. If you're playing on a general sized map and you're not using like 10, 15, or 20 foot squares, or your squares are the standard size, each square represents 5 feet, and you're on a standard map, which is I think 24 by 32 or 36,
something like that.
That fireball can, if you're in the center of that room, in that map, if you're on a map, and you can effectively hit almost any square on that map with fireball. Lightning bolt is 60 feet or 120 feet or something like that.
Yeah.
It can effectively hit most, if not all, that map, depending on where people are. So what I'm not saying is retool things to your advantage, but I also am saying that some of the information in there is kind of erroneous.
My players in one of my campaigns are going to meet. They actually just met Baba Yaga, and they were
Ooh.
like, "Oh, we're gonna fight." And I was like, first off, y'all are level 2, so
Well, here's the thing: it
reassess
doesn't even
yourself.
have to deal with you. You could just go into the astral plane and leave.
Yeah, I was like, reassess what you're thinking, right? So they met her because they're making the campaign I'm running is kind of very much based on concepts of like fairy tales. So they have to go make a deal with her. But they were ready to fight. And then I looked at like the hag stuff, and I was like, none of these spells are. The only reason why she would win is because she is dramatically stronger than them.
Yeah, I will say here's a perfect example. I'm looking at a night hag, which is a 9th level creature. It's
Yeah, that was
creature
actually
and 9. Yeah, I
the
mean
stat
this
I
is the
was looking
I
at.
think this is what Pathfinder is deemed the standard hag. There's a variety of different hags, right?
The green hags
But
and stuff.
but it's got 9th level spells. But those 9th level spells are Bind Soul and Ethereal Jaunt. Effectively, it can jump into the ethereal plane and just basically do a Doctor Strange, and it just zoop, and it can be in the astral plane, and then it could just walk around on its own, and it kind of exists there.
Oh, my favorite is Nightmare, which is a 5th level spell, and it only affects them when they're sleeping.
Yeah. But here's the thing. That spell they're not going to cast in combat. They're only going to be affecting sleeping creatures. So, I don't want to give any spoilers to. Yeah, I don't want to give any spoilers to the thing, but this could tell you. So the stat block in here. Do I need to know what Nightmare does? No, not at all, because I could look up the spell right in my prep. I'm going to go. I'm going to click on Nightmare and go. What does it do? Oh, it's only sleeping creatures. Oh, it does this, and oh, if you fail, you can go insane, or I think it's whatever. It's like you lose sanity effectively if you keep failing your save, and that's one of the things the hag wants to do. Right. So this informs you as the GM of how to use this creature. The fact that this thing is causing nightmares and it's binding people's souls tells you what the night hag wants to do. So this tells you why the PCs want to fight the hag, because the hag is stealing souls from people of the town. And if the night hag starts realizing that the PCs are getting close, they're going to start casting nightmares on the PCs. But this isn't a combat thing. So I don't have to know the exact rules of Nightmare. Yeah, do I need to know what the save is? It tells me DC 28. Every single spell this hag is going to cast, it's going to be DC 28. So I know, I walk in the door and I know anything that has a save is going to be that. So I can go, okay, what does Nightmare do? Do I really need to know the crit save? Yeah, if you want to use it against the players, yes. If you're not using it against the players, you effectively don't need, all you need to do is people complaining about nightmares.
Yeah.
Right, and maybe someone witnessed someone that person kept saying they had a nightmare for like 2 weeks, and all of a sudden they walked out of their house and they walked into the wilderness. Like why? Like, I don't know. It was like 3 a.m. And then if that keeps happening, then the PCs are going to get involved, right?
Yeah.
Right. So that could be in the back of my head for actions that the hag will take before combat. This is building up to the fact that the PC is going to be fighting the night hag. They're also going to once they figure out it's a night hag, hopefully they figure that out before the fight, because they can just zoop away. They may need to prepare themselves to deal with the hag and make sure the hag can't leave. This is something that I remember having to do. I'm not going to say the campaign it was in because I don't give spoilers, but that's something that my Sunday group, we had to deal with, and we had to fight a hag. So we had to be prepared for this. Now, there are some combat spells in here, but it tells me like, okay, so there's an 8th level spell, Dream Council. That's not a combat spell. I'm almost guaranteed that's not a combat spell. But like Shadow Blast is a definitely one that I'm going to be worrying about. It can cast that 2 times. Okay. And then it's got Magic Missile. It can cast that at will, and Invisibility at will, Ray of Enfeeblement at will. So at will just means it can cast it any amount of times at once.
But again, that like, so the moment you look at that and you're like, oh, it could do anything, then you should assess that. And then that kind of goes back to Steve's point, where you don't need the spell to be you don't need to know every little thing about the spell. You could just say, okay, Shadow Blast creates a blast of shadow energy, and it does A, B, C, or D, right? And then also, like, in that perspective, that's kind of what Steve was pointing out is, hey man, you don't really need to know every little detail about the spell that you're using as long as it makes sense. You're dealing with a hag, obviously, boil, toil and trouble. Maybe she gives everyone disadvantage because that's like a curse. She just goes curse, and now your characters all have disadvantage on certain actions, right? Whatever. Every time they try to like run, they have to make a check to see that they don't trip over their feet because she's causing them trouble, right? That's Steve's point of view. My point of view is I know I would do that and I would have players be upset. So you also like you also have to understand who you're playing with. If you're playing with people who are very lenient and want to tell a great story, then sure. If you're playing with people who have an encyclopedic knowledge of the stuff, they might get mad at you. Now, Steve's never gotten mad at me. Steve has corrected me after and offline. He was like, yo, man, like, you kind of did it wrong. And I was like, oh, yeah, but if I ever responded to Steve and I said, hey, I know I did it wrong and I was doing it wrong for the flair of the game, Steve would be like, oh, okay, cool. So you have to
and it
be
also
aware.
comes down now hags isn't a great example of what I was trying to get, the point I was trying to get to. But there are, say you want to have an evil cleric, right? And then evil cleric of say let's say you same level, 9th level, they're gonna have way more spells. And the hag has a lot of at-will spells. Like I said, they can cast them any number of times. But if you build out the cleric and the way that monsters are built, but you build it effectively, it's like an orc shaman or a cleric of whatever, Rovagug, or take your pick of all the evil gods out there. And you want to give them similar spells to how players cast spells, even though that monsters in Pathfinder and in most games, monsters and players do not work the same way.
No.
They use the same basic rules, like in Pathfinder, you have the 3-action system. They use the 3-action system. They have a reaction. Players have a reaction. And then when they're using spells, the spell, for the most part, works the way the spells work for the PCs. But it gets to the point where if I'm using a high-level spellcaster or a monster that has a lot of different spells, and okay, we have 2 of these spells and 2 of those spells and 3 of these, 1 of these, that's like way too much information. I need like 3 basic actions that my monster can take. Right? Yeah. Maybe they can, maybe they have also like an attack, and maybe they have some sort of movement ability. But effectively, if I'm dealing with a spellcaster, any more than 3 major abilities is going to be too much overhead for my head to deal with, because all the like we talked about before, all the other junk we're dealing with. So if I look at all their spells, I go, okay, what's their bread and butter? Maybe we give them an at-will spell, so when they run out of spells, they're going to have this one thing that they can keep doing. And they have a medium-level powered spell. Now, maybe you're using a spell that they have, and then in their spell list, that say, okay, well, maybe they cast 5th-level spells, 4th-level spells, and 3rd-level spells. So I'm going to make their 3rd-level spell, or maybe a bumped-up version of their 3rd-level spell, their at-will spell. So they can do that anytime that they want. Maybe they open with it. And then they're going to have that mid-level powered spell. Maybe they cast that. Maybe they do it 2 or 3 times. And that big spell, I'm going to give them a big spell, but it's only going to be like once in a counter. And does it work the same way as the spell that exists in the game? You can make it work. Yet again, all you have to do is write down the important details. It causes it gives everyone misfortune to anyone who's in the area. Misfortune would be disadvantage if and also a minus on any skill checks. Right? Let's say that's their big spell. It's just really to mess with the players. And then their medium spell they can cast 2 times is some sort of damage AoE spell. Maybe it's that shadowy blast, so I have the ability to, like, I'll shoot a line over here and then I'll shoot a blast over there and a big old AoE, or maybe a cone over here and a line over there. So it gives me a little bit of versatility. And that bread and butter spell is probably going to be 1 or 2 targets, and it's going to be like a damage spell, like effectively a souped-up cantrip.
Yeah.
Right? So we're not trying to break the game to win. We're trying to bend the rules of the game. And remember, monsters and players are different. So we can remember all the cool stuff that our monsters can do and give that battle for the players to remember the fight. Like, oh, you remember when that hag did that crazy move, or that evil cleric blew up one of their goblins and it's like made a bomb out of them? What? Like he blew up goblins and used them as bombs. Okay. That you're not going to tell me that your players are not going to remember when they got hit by an exploding goblin. You know, or whatever, like take your pick. Like you could technically take there's a actual spell in the game where it lets you blow up your familiar and it causes you damage. You just say it's not a familiar. He just lets you throw bomb goblins at you.
I want bomb.
Hey, you want bomb goblins now. But my point is to have the same effect. So when someone has an ability, when magic is cast upon me, I get this bonus. That's still going to apply because these are still treated as spells. But we also don't want to deal with 10 spells that we have to know, all of them, that half of them, first of all, don't even matter. And the other half of them, like, do I really need 5 different ways to deal damage? I could have one spell, effectively, if I really want, maybe the caster is designed to do lightning and fire and poison and acid, right? So I can effectively have one spell. I could take Shadowy Bolt, the Shadowy Blast that we just talked about, that you can make a cone, a line, a blast, and then we can make it to where the person, as the time of casting, can control the element that it deals. So now I have one spell that does a job of 5 spells. That's less overhead for me. I don't have to remember 5 different spells. I remember one spell, and I have to make a choice. Is it lightning damage this round? No. Well, I used lightning damage, and like half of them were resistant because the cleric cast endure elements lightning because they knew I liked lightning magic. Well, now it's fucking fire. Deal with that. You know, but I don't, and I have to remember 5 different spells. I remember one spell 5 different ways.
So, kind of like what Steve is saying, and talking about like building the spells and knowing your spells. Obviously, a lot of the stuff we talked about here has a level of difficulty behind it. Now, the concept here is you should probably know the system before you jump in and start changing the spell mechanics for your system. But once you have confidence in that, and by confidence, I mean at least a few sessions under your belt, knock yourself out. Create that spells that make sense. I think it would be cool, right? So I'm an old school WoW player, and kobolds in WoW used to walk around with a candle on their head. So maybe in your game, they do something similar. And then like in your spell, right? Because again, you're kind of making this up as you go. You can even make it as dramatic as you want. So the kobold reaches up and holds the candle, and that candle then like fires out like 3 produced flames, right? So it does like D4 damage, right? Like because it's a kobold shaman, but that's still thematic. And you could say, oh, it hits 1, 2, and 3 players, and you roll 3 attacks. Now the players are gonna be like, oh, what? Like that's cool. That's like something the kobold shaman specifically can do. But again, when you're making up these spells, now in the Runehammer video, he kind of mentions kind of like a bit of winging it and just talking it out with your players. I know personally, I have 2 games I play. I have a Monday game and I have a Wednesday game, and both of them start at around 8 p.m. and then we have work the next day. And so I know I don't have that much time to have a 15, 20-minute conversation with my players on the spells that they want to create as well as the spells I'm creating. So I think having your players understand that you, as your game arbiter, the game GM, whatever you want to call it, have a base understanding. They should feel comfortable with what you're doing. I think that's the point. Now, again, being the devil's advocate here, I'm saying I would be concerned because, again, if your players find out that you're just kind of winging it and making things up, they might get upset because we all agreed to play Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or Index Card RPG, which Runehammer creates. And suddenly you're kind of making up spells. They might be like, well, what's happening here? Now you could just be like, well, the monster has the spell. You don't know that. Meh.
Yeah, so at the end of the day, part of this conversation is about just making life easier for the GM, because do they need a 3-paragraph long spell to tell them I do damage in 30 feet with me? Yes. No, I just need to know I do 30 feet and how much damage does it deal. And 30. you could look to other spells to basically copy them and just throw away the junk that you don't need. If you know all your spells on this monster is going to just be a 30-foot range, you don't have to remind yourself of that. You just know, write a little note, 30 feet range on all spells. Yeah. Right. So I'm not as much saying you should develop brand new spells, which is the funny enough was the kind of the idea of Runehammer was develop your own spell system. So when your players have magic, you don't they don't always have that analysis paralysis come up and go, oh wait a minute, we need to get the protractor out, and then you have to figure out the angle of attack and do all this math, and like, oh wait, no, I can't cast that spell because it's going to hit 3 of my friendlies. Let me look at my 300-page book of spells to see what spell I can cast.
Skips the mighty gets first strike.
Yeah. Let's see. Pirate Samurai have +2 Constitution, -3 Charisma, divide by number of geese. Do we have a protractor?
So part of this is just trying to find a spell of the appropriate level and just trimming out the fat and making it easy for the GM to understand it. Like I said, the Runehammer video kind of goes into making it easy for everyone and everyone's on the same page. But I think that's more of we're developing our own system at that point. Now, like he said in the video, 12 to like 20 or 30 spells. It doesn't take someone that long to figure it out. But then if we're playing Pathfinder and we're still taking the Pathfinder math or the D&D math, we have to then take all that math and try to figure out how does it work if we're making brand new spells. We have to figure out how that math works in D&D. We have to figure out how that math works in. So that is a considerable amount of work, even if you're only making 12 or 20 or 30 spells. Mm-hmm. And you also, the players have to be on board with that. But I think that if you're making things, just boiling things down to make it easier to digest for you, since you are having to juggle so many plates. And even if you do tweak things to be a little more powerful here, or we give it this a little extra ability there, like I said about the spell, make Shadowy Blast. If I want to have an elemental master be the enemy, to take that same spell, but let me change so that spell already lets me change the size of the spell. So I can go cone, line, burst, all this stuff. Instead of just doing shadow damage, I could just say, oh, it's fire, electricity, cold, acid, right? The spell doesn't let me do that. I'm deciding that that's to be allowed because I'm the GM. Effectively, this, yet again, it goes back to this is guidelines. And we're not giving a spell to the players saying, you can use the spell in the way that I told you on Tuesday when I'm feeling good and you give me pizza. We're not saying that. We're not changing the rules for the players. We're not constantly having the players in flux, but we are having some of the monsters in flux for thematic purposes. If things get too out of balance, that's where the questions go. Like I said, if you're saying your first level kobold has Finger of Death, we have a problem here. We have more problems than balance than that. But
careful.
Yeah. Boom! It's like first level goblins just wrecking people.
He just finger blast you.
Yeah. So we're not talking about like who's winning. We are talking about telling good stories, and sometimes the rules make that hard, make it difficult. And we're just saying, rein that in, make it simpler. And if you do have to adjust something on your end, like, again, we're not even talking about flubbing die rolls. We're not talking about like, oh, I rolled a 15, but I've been rolling nonstop 19s and 20s the entire match. He crit failed. Because even though I rolled a 15, I'm still going to hit somebody, and most likely that was going to die. And that wasn't my intention, and I couldn't stop rolling 20s. That we're not talking about that. We're even just talking about taking spells, tweaking them a little bit for either thematic purposes or making something maybe a little more deadly. Maybe going from a 5th level spell to a 6th level spell is too much, but a 5th level spell doesn't have enough oomph. So maybe you tweak it a little bit, and you make that evil spellcaster or whatever the master of electricity. So anytime they cast electricity spells, they bump it up a little bit. And then, but all the other magic is just right out of the book. So it just makes things easier, and it lets you be unique. Because the one thing that you don't want is like, oh, it's just another troll shaman. Oh, it's just another orc chieftain. You don't ever want things to be samey. So when you can tweak stuff like that, and you're going to do something that the players haven't seen before, I think that's when it starts becoming memorable.
I agree. Sadly, I agree. This video could have just been two people agreeing and then high-fiving each other and then going away. Yay! But I think, again, have a bit of mastery on yourself, have a few games under your belt, and then once you feel comfortable, I don't disagree with some of this stuff. Obviously, some of the other crazier stuff is like rebuilding the entire magic system, and that's just crazy talk. But
there's a time and place for that, but
building your own system is a time and place. But with that being said, I want to say thank you very much to everyone out there. I want to say thank you very much to Rules Arbiter Steve for joining me in this conversation. And yeah, do the thing. Give us a click, a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or like there should be a third option, but it's like just two fingers pointing at each other. And then if you can do the subscription thing, I should have said that in the beginning, right? Because that's what pro YouTubers do. They ask you for the subscription in the beginning, and then not at the end. But I'm not a pro YouTuber because we're under 1,000 subscribers.
We just
I'm
like talking
allowed
about
to-
the thing, so we want to get right into it.
Yeah, exactly. So with all that being said, thank you very much for hanging out with us, and have a wonderful day, evening, time of place.
Later.
Bye.